Good afternoon. I'm Ben Hill. I'm with ATDC, which is Georgia Tech's new venture development group, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Clean Energy Speaker Series. Okay, is this a little better? There we go. I'll hold it. Thank you. Today's program, of course, is Southeast Biomass Project Development Incentives and Challenges, and this is a follow-on to our February program, which was Southeast Biomass Resource Analysis and Economics and Business Opportunities. I'd like to bring your attention to the website, secleanenergy.org, where today's program, the presentations and the webcast for today's program will be found, and presentations and webcasts from previous programs are archived and all is available for access and downloading. Just a few other announcements. I'd like to recognize a number of organizations and individuals who are making this program series possible. I'd like to thank Georgia Tech's Enterprise Innovation Institute and the law firm Sutherland, an international law firm with over 400 attorneys with home offices, or with roots rather, here in Atlanta. The Georgia Tech Strategic Energy Institute, the Georgia Tech Office of Sustainability, and the Brook Byers Institute for Sustainable Systems are always also helping out here. There are a number of advisors for the program series in the audience, and I'd like to recognize them. I think Professors Valerie Thomas and David Scholl will be here shortly. Dr. Jay Hakes from the Carter Center is here. Thank you. And Mr. Ken Ostrowski with McKinsey & Company will be joining us as well. In terms of the format for today, the presentations, we'll start off with introductions, then presentations, followed by a question and answer period. For those of you who are joining us over the web, please send your questions to me at my email address, and I will relay those questions to the speakers. My email address is ben.hill@georgiatech.edu. That's ben.hill@gatech.edu. And we look forward to getting your questions from those of you participating over the web. Just another note is the plan to join us for the April and May programs, which will be on solar in the Southeast. These two programs will be the last Wednesdays of April and May, which I think is April the 28th and May the 26th, where once again we'll look at, in a series, look at resources, economics, and business opportunities for solar, and then we'll look at projects and public policy and incentives and challenges in deploying solar in the Southeast. So be sure, once again, April 28th and May 26th. Thank you very much for being here. Please spread the word about this valuable program series with your friends and colleagues and others. And at this point, I'd like to turn over to Marcia Ward with Sutherland, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Sutherland is proud to be a co-sponsor today for this Clean Energy Speakers Series. Just to tell you a little bit about Sutherland, we are an Atlanta headquartered full-service law firm, and we have a very robust practice area in energy and environmental law, corporate tax, financial services, intellectual property, litigation, real estate. And it's been mentioned, we have about 400 attorneys in offices in D.C., in New York, in Houston, and Austin, Texas, in addition to Atlanta. We have about 50 lawyers that are engaged in practicing in our energy and environmental group, and that includes our renewable and alternative energy practice. And we demonstrate our commitment every day to our renewable and alternative energy, as we are a leader among law firms in establishing environmentally sustainable business practices. And as you'll see today, Sutherland also leverages the experience that we have in our various practice groups within the firm to strengthen our representation of, as well as our counsel to, biomass, solar, wind, biofuels, and nuclear clients, as in addition to our renewable and alternative energy. Our speakers today are well qualified and well experienced in the biomass area, and particularly with challenges and incentives that are happening in the practice area today. Marvin Burchfield is a vice president with Decker Energy International. He has extensive experience in commercial and industrial construction, and he's held roles in construction, sales, engineering, research, operations, development, and executive management in companies such as Ralston Purina, Carrier Corporation, as well as Duke Energy prior to his stint at Decker Energy. In addition to his work at Decker, Marvin's also involved with the Board of Managers for Biomass Energy Resources. Just to let you know a little bit about Decker, and I know Marvin's going to tell you a little bit more, but it's a very experienced company since 1982 in building, acquiring, owning, and operating biomass and facilities. And currently, Decker has a 55 megawatt biomass project under development in Fitzgerald, Georgia. So there's a story right here in our own backyard that Marvin's going to share with us. And I think he's going to give us some very real-world experiences about project management and project development challenges. So we're pleased that he could join us today. And our first speaker is a Sutherland colleague, Amish Shah. He's based in our Washington, D.C. office. His primary area that he practices in is tax, but we again leverage that to bring his experience to the renewable and alternative energy field. He handles his tax matters that he handles generally involve domestic as well as international tax planning and tax controversy. He has significant experience in advising clients with respect to incentives for investments in and production of renewable and alternative energy. Amish advises his clients with respect to tax incentives as well as tax grants from the Department of Treasury. And he's going to tell us a little bit more about that today as he tells us more about the tax incentives and grants.
All right, can everyone hear me? Is the microphone working? Great. I want to thank you, Marcia, for that introduction, and I want to thank you all for allowing me to join you this afternoon. And it's great to see so many folks here, given that we have such incredible weather outside today. I've got about 30 minutes of material that I want to present, and I think the best way to spend that time is to talk to you a little bit about the incentives that are available right now for biomass and other renewable energy projects. Without going too far into the weeds on that, and then talk about some of the policy issues and other issues that we've been dealing with in this area. So with that, when I think about incentives for renewable energy, I generally put these into four categories. The first is incentives for production of electricity. The second is incentives for producing equipment that's used to make renewable energy, for example, solar panels. The third are incentives for biofuels or alternative fuels, and the fourth is kind of a catch-all category of other incentives that folks need to be looking at when they're thinking about investing in a renewable energy project. Now, starting with the first, the electricity from renewable resources, there are three primary categories or types of incentives: the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, and the Treasury grant. The production tax credit is available if you have three particular requirements that you meet. First, you have to use qualified energy resources, and you'll see the list up there. I won't read them all again, but that, of course, includes biomass, open and closed loop biomass. You need to produce electricity at a qualified facility, and the main requirement to be a qualified facility, at least with respect to biomass, is that you need to have your facility placed in service by a particular date. And for biomass, that means you have to have your facility operational before the end of 2013. And finally, for the production tax credit, you need to sell your electricity to an unrelated person. And what that means is you have to have an ultimate sale to an unrelated person. So if you have a facility that sells electricity to a related person, say a utility, and the utility on-sells that to retail customers, that's fine. You meet the requirements of selling to an unrelated person. So those are the three primary requirements for obtaining the production tax credit. How much is a production tax credit? That's always a big question. It's either 2.1 cents or 1.1 cent per kilowatt hour of electricity you produce. And when we're talking about biomass, we're talking about 1.1 cent per kilowatt hour. The main type of facility that gets 2.1 cents is a wind facility. You get this tax credit for the first 10 years that the facility is in operation. So at the end of each year, you calculate how much electricity you produce, and you take the credit for the first 10 years. One thing that's important with the production tax credit is, in an effort to avoid oversubsidization of these types of projects, the government said, well, if you have other types of incentives that you're using that are geared towards promoting energy efficiency projects, they're going to reduce the amount of the production tax credit you can get. So you need to think about, making sure you mix and match the right types of incentives when you're thinking about trying to obtain the production tax credit in order to maximize the benefits you can get from the government. Who's entitled to the tax credit? This is very important. It's the owner of the facility. Now, one of the things about a tax credit is, as many of you probably know, is a tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction of your tax liability, which means if you have no tax liability, it's not very helpful to you, generally. And so what folks have been doing when they want to get the production tax credit, if they have no tax liability or very little tax liability, is they entered into certain structures where they effectively monetize their production tax credit. So that means if you've got $100 of production tax credits coming to you and you have no tax liability, you effectively somehow sell your tax credits to someone else. And you can't do that directly. You need to enter into certain structures to do that, and we'll talk about that just in a little bit. But it's important to note that with the production tax credit, it's again, a tax credit, and available against your liability or available to monetize as well. The next type of tax credit we talk about is the investment tax credit. And again, that's available for all of the types of facilities that you could get the production tax credit for, including biomass. But it's also available for solar, combined heat and power, and the other bullets you see up there as well. So in other words, it's a more expansive list of items for which you can get the investment tax credit. Again, the requirement to get the investment tax credit, you have to have the facility placed in service by a particular date. Now, when we're talking about all of the bullet points up there with the exception of the last one, generally that means you have to have your facility placed in service by 2017. When we're talking about the types of property for which you could have gotten a production tax credit, but you instead choose to get the investment tax credit, those facilities, including biomass, need to be placed in service before the end of 2013. So again, it's important to note that there is a time frame and a deadline for putting these facilities in service in order to get the tax credits here. The amount of the credits. The investment tax credit is a 30% credit. So whatever the cost of your facility is, for example, a biomass facility, the government will give you 30% credit. So if you have a $100 million facility, you get a $30 million tax credit in the year that you construct your facility. So it's a one-time credit in the year that you construct your facility. Again, it's available to the owner of the facility. But unlike the production tax credit, you remember when I talked about the production tax credit, I said, well, if you get other incentives, the government may try and reduce your credit that's available to you. One of the things the government recently did was they had the same provision in the investment tax credit, but they changed that. They took that away and said, look, we don't really care if you're getting a lot of other incentives. We're still not going to reduce the amount of your investment tax credit. They did that with respect to the investment tax credit, but not the production tax credit. So you can take advantage of lots of different types of incentives and without reducing the availability of your ITC, your investment tax credit. Again, it's a tax credit, dollar-for-dollar reduction of your tax liability, and if you don't have any tax liability, you can still take advantage of the investment tax credit through certain monetization structures, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. All right, this is a big one I want to talk about, the Treasury Grant Program, because this is really something that we've, in our firm, seen a lot of activity with respect to. Now, unlike the investment tax credits and production tax credits, this is a cash payment from the government, and so if you decide to go into this program, you're foregoing your opportunity to take advantage of the tax credits I just talked about, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, and instead you're opting for a cash grant. Again, how do you get this? You have to have a type of property for which you could have otherwise obtained a production tax credit or investment tax credit. So biomass, solar, wind, geothermal, all of those types of facilities. This is a limited time program. So you either have to have completed your project during 2009 or 2010, or you have to begin construction under a binding contract before the end of this year. Now, when we talk about beginning construction, there are very specific rules that Treasury's put out as to what it means to begin construction. There are a set of rules that were put out back in July of 2009 regarding the beginning construction requirements, and they were, I think a lot of people thought they were difficult to meet. Earlier this month, Treasury came out with revised guidelines as to what it means to begin construction. And they've made it a little bit easier to meet that test. And I think at this point, we're still working with Treasury. We're talking to Treasury about exactly what we need to do to meet the beginning of construction requirement to get this grant. But I think the key point is we are still talking to folks right now who really haven't done much with their project to this point, and are still hoping to begin construction before the end of this year. So there's still some opportunity to use the grant program. What do you get? You get a 30% grant from the Department of the Treasury. So, you know, I've heard some folks and I've had some clients say, well, this almost seems a little bit too good to be true. And some folks were skeptical about the government actually giving you that much cash. And I tell you, and I bring this up just to assure folks that I think the program is what it claims to be. We have a client who built a facility, a biomass facility, and spent $140 million for that facility. They placed in service at the end of 2009, and within 2 months after we applied for a Treasury grant, the government sent us a $40 million check. So it was good to see that the program was operating, I think, as Congress intended it to operate. A couple of things about this. Again, it's similar to the ITC in that you can still take advantage of other incentives from the government and get the grant as well, so they're not mutually exclusive. One of the benefits you get, and we'll talk about this later as well, is you get depreciation deductions for these facilities, and you get accelerated depreciation deductions. You do get a little bit of a haircut in the amount of depreciation deduction you get if you take advantage of the grant. Again, the grant is available within, you get payment of the grant within 60 days after you file your application for the grant. And now what that means is when Treasury determines your application is complete, the 60-day clock starts running. So Treasury can, theoretically, you can file a grant application on the 59th day. They can come to you and say, hey, we've got a couple more questions for you, and restart the 60-day clock. And theoretically, they can keep doing that. But I tell you, in the experience that we've had with them, they've really been trying to push the dollars out the door and trying not to take advantage of those types of provisions and really get the money out within 60 days after you file the application. A very important thing about the grant is non-taxable. So if you have a $100 million facility and they give you a $30 million cash payment, you get to keep all $30 million. They're not going to give with one hand and take away 35% of it in taxes with the other hand. So that's been very helpful. Possible or complete partial recapture of the grant. You need to make sure that for a period of 5 years after you get the grant, you keep doing what you said you're going to do. In other words, when you get the grant, you may be using qualified materials, biomass to generate electricity. Once you get the grant, you can't turn around and start using natural gas or coal. For a period of 5 years, you need to use the materials you said you were going to use. After the 5-year period, you can use whatever you want to with the facility and you still get to keep your money. Who gets the grant? It's the owner of the facility on the day that you commence operations. There are certain types of entities that aren't technically entitled to the grant. So when Congress enacted the statute, they said certain types of entities, for example, electric cooperatives, governmental entities, that they couldn't take advantage of the grant program. Treasury came in and said, well, they can't take advantage of it directly, but if you insert a blocker corporation, in other words, if you have, say, a municipality owning an interest in a corporation, and the corporation owns a facility, well, the corporation can get this 30% grant. And so there are structuring ways, there are ways to structure around the impermissibility of certain types of entities getting this grant. And no recapture of the grant if the facility is sold. One of the things about the investment tax credit that makes it a little bit more difficult to take advantage of is for a period of 5 years, if you get the investment tax credit, for a period of 5 years, you can't sell the facility. If you sell the facility, you're required to repay some portion of the grant, of the investment tax credit to the government. What they've done in the Treasury grant program is they've made it easier to transfer a facility to someone else to sell a facility. So if within the 5-year period you sell a facility to someone else after you've received the grant, that's fine, as long as it's a type of person that's eligible for the grant, and that's really just about anyone if you structure things properly. So the free transferability of these projects, I think, is a quite helpful trait in the grant program. There are, as we've been talking about these incentives, there are a number of things we've been looking at, and I was on the Hill about a little over a year ago. And one of the things that Ways and Means was talking about, and Incentive Finance was talking about, was technology neutrality. Why are we incentivizing some projects more than we're incentivizing other types of projects? Why are we picking winners and losers? And I remember Bacchus, Incentive Finance, he said, well, we ought to, we ought to incentivize. We shouldn't pick winners and losers. But in reality, that's what they've done. At this point, we have different termination dates for these grants. Solar's, you can get benefits for solar up until the end of 2016. You can only get the benefits for wind up through the end of 2012, and you can get the benefits for biomass and most of the other types of renewable energy up until the end of 2013. And so you ask, well, why are there different dates for all of this? Why are we giving a longer time frame to solar versus biomass? And frankly, I think the answer is that when they draft these statutes, all of these incentives cost the government money, and they need to score it at a certain amount, and they extend these incentives as long as they can, and still to be able to score it at the right amount. And I think that's the practical reason why they do that. But I think in reality, the complaint, I think, of many developers, and Marvin maybe would speak to this as well, is that the short term, if you have only a couple years before the tax credit of the incentive expires, for larger projects, it's often difficult to build that project and know that the credit of the grant will be available to you when you're done with your project. I think from a practical perspective, we all think, well, a lot of these incentives will be extended, but obviously, again, that's probably not something you can bank on. Again, technology neutrality, the amount. One of the things that we've seen is that wind, for example, in the production tax credit gets a 2.1 cent per kilowatt hour benefit. In biomass, it's 1.1 cent. I don't know that there's any rational basis for having different amounts of tax credits for both those types of resources, particularly when you can get a 30% ITC or grant with respect to wind, and you can get a 30% ITC or grant with respect to biomass. Why are there different production tax credit amounts for those types of resources? Again, we've seen a lot of legislation trying to equalize that, but nothing has passed so far. And fortunately, when we see the legislation trying to equalize it, it's trying to equalize it at the 2.1% rate rather than the 1.1 cent rate. Let's see, some inconsistencies that we see among these programs that we're thinking about. And when we think about this stuff, the reason that we think about all these inconsistencies and we think about the technology neutrality issues, when I open up my email every morning, I get a list of, I get a lot of information about the bills that were passed the last year, the bills that were introduced in the previous day regarding renewable energy projects. And when you see these, you see what people are trying to do here, which is, they're trying to get some more technology neutrality and trying to eliminate some of the inconsistencies among these types of incentives here. So the first is a sale at unrelated person requirement. As you saw in the production tax credit regime, you only get the production tax credit if you generate electricity and sell it to some other person. So if you use it in your own facility, you don't get the tax credit. If you sell it to someone else, you do. For the investment tax credit and the grant, you can generate the electricity and use it at your own facility. Again, there's a distinction there, and I'm not sure of why that is, and there are, I guarantee, a lot of folks on the Hill that are trying to get the sale to unrelated person requirement eliminated from the production tax credit statute, but haven't been successful to this point yet. The reduction for subsidized energy financing, that was there, as I said, if you get production tax credit, if you get other incentives, they may reduce the amount of the production tax credit if you get other incentives. That was the case for the investment tax credit as well until February of last year. They limited that requirement or that haircut for the investment tax credit, but not for the production tax credit. We'll see if that changes at some point in the future when the production tax credit is extended, or if it's extended. Facility transferability, we talked about that a little bit as well with the production tax credit. It's a 10-year tax credit. If in year 5 you sell the facility, the purchaser of the facility can get the remaining 5 years of production tax credit. With the investment tax credit, if you sell the facility, you've got to pay some of your investment tax credit back to the government, and with a Treasury grant, if you sell your facility, you get to keep the full amount of your grant without repaying anything back. Again, these are things that just don't make a lot of sense, and future legislation we should push in future legislation for those inconsistencies to be resolved. And tax-exempt entities, again, very quickly, as I mentioned, the investment tax credit isn't available to tax-exempt entities. The Treasury grant is available to tax-exempt entities as long as they use a blocker corporation. So Treasury has created a mechanism for tax-exempt to take advantage of the grant, but not for tax-exempt to take advantage of the investment tax credit. Major last point, I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, the extension of the grant program. This grant program, from my point of view and from the clients I've talked to, has been really incentivizing them to produce projects, to build solar projects, to build biomass projects. But we're coming to the end of the year. We've been talking to clients about doing biomass projects or doing solar projects since this legislation came out in February of 2009. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of people saying, oh, shoot, this program ends in 9 months now. We better start doing something. So they're finally starting to think about doing something. And the question I keep getting asked is, well, how do I begin construction before the end of this year? What do I need to do to put my stake in the ground and be treated as beginning construction so I can get the grant? And that's what a lot of my conversations these days relate to. What we're hoping to see is an extension of this grant program. There's been some legislation introduced to extend the grant program for a couple of years, but I think with Congress focusing on a number of other bills, most recently, of course, the health care bill, notwithstanding the fact that we've heard a lot of buzz on the Hill from, in support of extending the grant, we haven't really seen a lot of movement on that issue. Again, the good thing about the grant program is if you're a developer of a project, whereas with the tax credits, you have to go through some sort of gyrations to monetize your tax credit. With the grant, you don't need to do all of that. You simply need to apply for your grant and you get it in cash. And let me give you some examples of the gyrations you need to go through for the tax credit program. A couple of the ways that if you have a production tax credit or investment tax credit, and this will be the regime we'll be back to in 2011 if the grant program's not extended, which is fine. This is a regime we were in before 2009 as well. If you're a developer with no tax liability or not enough tax liability to use your tax credits, you need to monetize your tax credits. And there are one of two ways to do that, either through what we call the flip structure or what we call a sell-leaseback structure. And I'll just very quickly touch upon what these are just to give you a sense of the transactions that you go through if you're in that position. In a typical flip structure, you have a developer who's interested in developing a project, and they bring in what we call a tax equity investor, who is someone who may or may not be in the renewable energy industry, but simply has enough tax liability to use available tax credits from a project. And we'll give this example in the production tax credit context. So you've got a tax credit that's available for 10 years. So what you do is you bring in you've got the developer who, you drop your facility, say your biomass facility, down into an LLC, which is treated as a partnership for tax purposes. The developer operator holds a 1% interest in that partnership, or something approaching 1%. And the investor who comes in and has the ability to use tax credits takes a large stake in that operating LLC. What does the developer get in exchange for giving the investor the large interest? They get some sort of financing or cash. At the end of the day, that's their monetization. They get cash for doing that. During the first 10 years of the project, this is the ownership structure. And the production tax credits are available during this time as well. And so because the investor owns a 99% interest in this facility, 99% of the tax credits are being pushed out to the investor. The investor, of course, again, is someone who can use the tax credits. Beginning in year 11, there are no tax credits available anymore. So the partnership agreement would provide that there's an automatic flip in ownership interests in year 11. In year 11, all of a sudden, the developer would become the 95% owner of the facility. The investor would become the 5% owner. The investor's interest is not quite as valuable as it once was because there's only 5% owner. And it leaves the developer with an opportunity to buy out the investor during this year 11. So what's really happened here? During this 11-year period, investor comes in. They bring a lot of cash to the project, which the developer can use for the project itself or for whatever project they may want to use it for. And the investor is paid its return by using tax credits. And to the extent they need a larger return, some cash may go to them as well. But in effect, the developer is getting financing for the project and paying off the financing using tax credits. That's a monetization strategy. And at the end of that 11-year period, the developer would buy out the investor and own an entire interest in the facility, and they're back to where they started, back to where they want to be. And that's the way we did these projects for developers before the Treasury grant was introduced in 2009, and that's the way we'll go back to doing it in 2011, assuming that the grant isn't extended. The other way we do these things is the sale-leaseback structure, and this being a biomass conference, I'm only going to touch upon this quickly because we really can't do this for a biomass type of project. But the idea generally is to sell a project to someone who can use the tax credits, and then that person who can use the tax credits now owns the projects, takes the tax credits, and leases it back to the developer for a period of time. At the end of the lease term, there's a fair market value option to transfer the project back to the developer. So this would be the general type of structure that we're talking about. Again, this isn't available for biomass. It is available, and we've seen this more in the solar context. But again, these are the types of transactions that we would need to undertake to monetize a tax credit for a developer without much tax liability. As I mentioned at the top, there are four categories, I think, of the way I think about tax credits or incentives for projects. The first was incentives for renewable energy, producing electricity from renewable energy. The second here is qualified advanced energy projects, actually manufacturing equipment that's used to produce renewable energy. In that program, there was $2.3 billion. This was funded to the tune of $2.3 billion in 2009. And the way you get this tax credit, unlike the other tax credits I talked about, the way you get this tax credit is if you want to build a facility that will, for example, construct solar equipment, you have to apply to the government for some chunk of that $2.3 billion. And so folks did that last year, and they oversubscribed to this program. In other words, there were folks who wanted to build manufacturing facilities, but there weren't enough tax credits available for all of them. The administration has tried to extend this program to the tune of another $5 billion. Again, with everything going on in the Hill these days, that hasn't happened yet, but hopefully sometime in the near future we'll see further incentives for generating manufacturing equipment in the U.S. And from a policy point of view, one of the criticisms of the Treasury grant program from some folks on the Hill is that even though the grant's only available for projects that are constructed in the U.S., that a lot of the money is going offshore. So if you build a wind facility in the U.S., the turbines are probably coming from overseas. And so the criticism of Congress is, well, we're giving a 30% grant to you, and you're building in the U.S., but most of that money is just going overseas to the manufacture of this equipment. And there's some folks who said on the Hill that said, all right, we ought to cut off the Treasury grant program and put in a Buy American provision. You need to buy American-made manufactured equipment for your project to get the Treasury grant. The problem with that is we don't have enough manufacturing capability in the U.S. to produce enough solar panels, to produce enough wind turbines to meet the needs of the developers of these types of projects. So I can't imagine seeing a Buy American provision in the Treasury grant program until and unless we incentivize folks to manufacture solar panels and other types of things in the U.S. I'm going to talk quickly and very quickly about some of the biofuels credits. You've got biofuels credits for alcohol, and the primary one there is ethanol. You've got it for biodiesel as well, and biodiesel is a very particular fuel. It's something that meets certain ASTM standards. And the third one you have is the alternative fuels credits. And the alternative fuels credits, it's less specific than ethanol and biodiesel. And the point of the alternative fuels credits were to say, look, we want to encourage innovation of alternative fuels, and so we're not going to, with ethanol, we've said ethanol is a particular type of fuel, and biodiesel is a particular type of fuel. But if you innovate and you produce some other type of fuel that we think is worthy of getting a tax credit, we're going to give you this type of tax credit to incentivize you to do that. One of the issues we've seen with respect to this is that I think it's been used in some unintended ways, in unintended manners by some industries. Not to say that's right or wrong, but it's a very open statute, and it allows for various types of fuels to get this kind of credit. A couple issues we've seen with alternative fuels credit and the biodiesel credit, and in fact with the ethanol credit. As you'll see at the bottom here, the alcohol fuels credit expires at the end of 2010. The biodiesel credit expired at the end of last year, and the alternative fuel credit expired at the end of last year. And this is a problem that we see with the fuels credits. that we get short-term extensions of the fuel credits, usually for a year at a time. And what we often see is at the end of that year, the credit's not extended. And what happens, and what we see happening with biodiesel right now and alternative fuels, is that everyone on the Hill agrees that these credits ought to be extended. They just haven't done it yet. And so we see a lot of bills where they're extending these, but again, they're just not getting passed yet. And they're not getting passed not because people disagree on the extension of the biofuels, it's just they're attached to other bills, larger bills, and they don't agree on the other provisions of the larger bills. Ultimately, what we expect to happen with alternative fuels and biodiesel is that those credits will be extended, and they'll be extended retroactive to 1/1/2010, so as though they never expired. But again, if you're building a biodiesel facility or trying to generate biodiesel, it's very difficult to take the risk at this point that the credit will necessarily be retroactively extended to the beginning of this year. And again, it creates a lot of uncertainty in the industry that Congress is trying to help develop. One of the things I mentioned on these fuels credits is, and this has been important for a number of our clients, I think the main thing to keep in mind with these fuels credits is if you're fueling anything, whether it's a motor vehicle or some sort of manufacturing operation, and you're using something other than fossil fuel to do that, and it's a liquid fuel, you need to be thinking about whether or not there's some sort of a tax credit available to you. And I think that's really the key takeaway on the fuels credits. Again, we talked about extension periods, some of the policy issues regarding that. We need longer term, I think, extensions of these fuel credits. And I think we need to, I talked about neutrality, of technology neutrality. We need to encourage innovation of fuels that we just haven't thought about to this point. We need to figure out a way to do that, give incentives for doing that, and at the same time make sure that we're doing it for the right types of fuels that really benefit our environment and our society going forward. Those are the challenges for folks on the Hill. Very quickly, a couple of other thoughts, other benefits. When we talk about incentives for renewable energy projects, we spend a lot of time talking about all the federal incentives. We've got to think about depreciation as well. There's accelerated depreciation available for these types of projects, which gives you, again, helps you return on an investment in these renewable energy projects. State tax incentives. I think many of you have seen Georgia and other states, particularly in New Jersey, we've seen offer great state tax incentives. And so in your calculation of what the return is on investing in a renewable energy project, you need to take that into account as well. I list a BCAP program here, the Biomass Crop Assistance Program in here, just as an example of other types of programs. And that's a program out of Department of Agriculture. There are programs out of DOE, Ag, and other parts of our government. And depending on what your project is, you've got to think about what all these other incentives are. And I mentioned the BCAP program because it's an interesting program that's in a point of flux right now. BCAP was introduced back in 2008 and it was never funded. In 2009, there are two parts to this program. One is a matching payment program, and I'll talk about that one first. In 2009, Department of Ag came out with rules on this program. They said effectively, if you collect biomass and you deliver it to a facility that will generate electricity, and it's a qualifying facility that generates electricity using the biomass, you can get a matching payment from the government up to $45 a dry ton. So if you sell your biomass to this qualifying facility for $20 a dry ton, the government will give you another $20 of cash under this program if you apply and you qualify. With respect to that matching program and this program in general, very recently, Ag came out with proposed rules regarding this program, and they started thinking about this a little bit. And they said, well, do we really need to incentivize folks to go collect biomass at $45 a dry ton? Is that over-subsidization of this? Could we get away with doing it, say, $9 or $10 a dry ton and still, get people to collect biomass and put it into a facility to generate electricity? And so there's some proposed rules out there on this BCAP program, and comments are flowing into Ag regarding that program right now. And comments are due April 9th, and I think sometime after that we'll see exactly how this program turns out. But the big question on the matching payments is, do they continue to give out the $45 a dry ton matching payment, or do they decide that there's some lower amount that's necessary to incentivize folks to collect biomass to generate electricity? Very quickly, there's an establishment and annual payment program under the BCAP program as well, which incentivizes folks to grow and produce biomass as well for use in generating electricity. And those rules are being fleshed out as well as part of the proposed rules that folks are commenting on right now. With that, I'll leave it and I'll turn it over to Marvin.
See if I can get this working here. Before I get started, I'm going to apologize because there's a couple of people in the room that's seen a large portion of a number of these slides, and in particular, you're going to see a rehash of some stuff that you've already seen, and maybe even Turner has seen some of this as well. Excuse me just a second. First, thank you. Thank Sutherland for inviting me to come speak to this august body. Being a Clemson Tiger, I feel a little bit out of place, but we'll see how that goes, and I hope I don't disappoint you too much there, Marcia. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about biomass. It's something that I've spent a big chunk of my recent life on. And my view here this morning is not to really dictate what you... I'm sorry, move this up. Is that better? Good. But really to inform and encourage a really ruthless pursuit of a view on the issues. You know, whether or not biomass to power is good or bad really depends entirely on your perspective. They are legitimate, I guess I've heard Congress say it before, you know, reasonable people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. But I do believe that's true. At the end of the day, though, it goes beyond simple questions like what kind of feedstock is sustainable and what is the cost per million BTUs and those kind of things. It really is, the issues are really very dynamic, they're interconnected, and they're interdependent. As an example, just ask this question based on the presentation Amish just did. How many of you, you got 3 different major tax credits you talked about, ITC, PTC, and cash grant. How many think the PTC is the best way? How about ITC? Cash grant. Okay, some of you are not voting, so that's not good. But the answer is you're all wrong. It depends entirely on your tax situation. If you are a private equity firm, cash grant's what you want. If you are an entity with a very large tax appetite, ITC is what you want. If you're a regulated utility, PTCs look much, much better to the ratepayer. So it entirely depends on what your tax status is. And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make here with regard to biomass. What I hope to present to you is a viewpoint from a seasoned energy asset developer. I've got about a 30-year track record of doing things with economic success, having positive community relationships, and having minimal to benign kind of environmental impacts. Talk a little bit about the electric industry overall. I'm going to assume some just very little knowledge that you have on that. I'll talk about the renewable power industry just a bit. The economics of some of the alternatives that we're talking about, and then the statutory, regulatory, tax type implications that we're talking about here. And I'm only really going to highlight some of that. So to get started, must say that I feel a little bit like this old man at the sea here, sailing into the unknown. Marcia insists that I'm not being set up for an ambush, so I'm going to trust her on that. So maybe I'm not the old man here. Maybe I'm a bit more dashing. But maybe the situation is a little bit like this fella here. He's on a ship sailing from the old world to the new world, and got some very valuable cargo on board. And into the journey, on the horizon, they spy a ship, like the previous slide there. First mate goes to the captain and says, "That's pirates. You want me to call them into the battle stations?" And he says, No. Go to my cabin and get me the red shirt." Well, first mate's very loyal, so he runs off and gets the red shirt and comes back, and soon the battle ensues. And they have a ferocious battle, but they ultimately prevail and they sail on. A few days later, they view this on the horizon, bunch of pirate ships. So the first mate, knowing what the captain did, said, shall I go get the red shirt? And he says, "No, I don't think you want to get me the red shirt. I think maybe you need to get me the brown pants." So the point being is that, I hope I'm not setting myself up here to soil myself, so to speak. But I trust our situation is accurate here. Let me talk about some fundamental issues here. I speak at a lot of different settings like this, renewable energy conferences, finance conferences, and all that kind of thing. The fundamental aspect that escapes most people is we're talking about the energy business first. It is, you got to have real energy, delivering real capacity, and delivering real value. They are extensive policy implications associated with that, and you're really working in a commodity marketplace. And if you don't understand that, when you're talking about any of these energy perspectives, you set yourself up for a colossal failure. Not just individually, but the marketplace itself. One of the primary problems we have, I get asked often, who is your stiffest competition? And contrary to Bob Turner's belief, it is not Sterling Planet. It is an ill-conceived competing project because it creates expectations that are unsustainable, both in the eyes of the economic development crowd, in the eyes of the academic crowd. Well, academics are generally the ones that create the unsustainable expectations. In the environmentalist perspective and in the public policy arena, there are expectations that set up that are just not achievable. So I'm going to get on a soapbox here for just a second. There are entities that have as their goal to completely replace and eliminate our fossil fuel system. Well, that's just not a possibility. It's not a reality in this country. Our economic engine is built on the back of carbon energy. Can we be more responsible in the way we use it? Yes, and we absolutely should. But to imagine that we're going to go to pure wind and pure solar is really kind of what's the word? Pipe dream. I was thinking of a word that started with N and just dropped. Yeah, maybe. Now I grew up a couple hours north of here. My relatives came into the port of Philadelphia and migrated down through the Yadkin Valley and into the Tallulah Gorge back in the late 1600s and early 1700s. I am fiercely protective of that part of the world. It's beautiful, it's wild. I love hunting and fishing and all those kind of things, and I want to protect that environment. But we date back, you know, I can trace our ancestry back to Hadrian's Wall nearly, back to the Scots-Irish. And all of that culture is built around you know, a fierce independence and responsibility for oneself. Today, what we have going on is we have our ability to pursue, you know, the liberty that we have to pursue those things is really being co-opted by a variety of different parties to force worldviews about what should and shouldn't be based on a personal opinion. My role here really is to cause you to think about that. So let me just show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. This is a little cabin down Turkey Creek, Florida, about 100 years ago. You can see the gray area here up in the upper right-hand corner where smoke is coming out of the stack. Now, you know, this is how biomass was originally used. It's used for cooking and heating. At that point in time, it was a very common fuel source. I can tell you my grandmother lived up in the mountains in North Georgia, preferred to cook on a wood stove and cook canned green beans with a wood stove until she died about a decade ago. Really preferred that. But most people have moved beyond a basic need. We started using wood for motive power. You can see a little expeditionary boat here. There's a very proper alligator hunt going on here with young ladies and young men, you know, hunting alligators. But you can see there's some obvious environmental impacts. The particulate matter coming out of something like this is atrocious. We don't do that anymore. We also started moving bigger vehicles. You can see the wood tender there behind that locomotive, but you can also see the environmental impact associated with that. No, we don't do that anymore. But this is my point of, and even this one here, which is an old steamboat on the Indian River. The point here is this is an energy source that we've used for a long time, and most of the Western world has moved away from using, quote, biomass. A large portion of the world has not. It is still a very, very important energy source for them. Kind of the point I want to make here, though, is that oil and gas and even coal, we'd like for a really, really singular reason. It is an extraordinarily dense energy source. It makes it very easy to transport and very easy to manipulate. Biomass, wind, solar, geothermal, they're all very, very geologically or geographically specific. You do not have the flexibility that you have with fossil fuels. So my point is not to say that we got to get rid of fossil fuels and go to 100% biomass, nor is it to say we should be 100% biomass with no wind or no solar. What we really want to talk about is understand the nature of the magnitude of energy that we're talking about. These are a few of the information sources that are out there, largely from the federal government. I would encourage you to run these down and chase these down. These come out periodically, not only annually, but they come out quarterly. And you can start to get a feel for what the energy demand looks like in this country. This slide, some of you have probably seen, it's a little bit dated. But the point to take away from this is that all of our energy uses are very, very interrelated. Congress makes a decision about what we're going to do with biofuels, the BCAP program that Amish was talking about, and it has extraordinary impact on what you're going to do with solid fuel facilities. They do not exist independently. What we're really now talking about today, though, is flowing into electric power. What I'm talking about is flowing into electric power. This, if you take a look at our sources, did I lose something? If you take a look at our sources here of the energy that flows into electric power, you can see that the dominant energy source is natural gas and coal-based. And we're talking about renewable energy is the point in this with biomass is, what does that look like? To give you a kind of a frame of reference, 100 megawatt biomass plant, which none exist today, there's one being constructed, will generate about 2/100ths of that amount in the course of a year. So the impact is extraordinarily tiny when we're talking about renewable energy. What does that industry look like today? You've got about 7,000 biomass projects, or 7,000 megawatts of biomass capacity in all types. Something less than 2,200 megawatts of standalone facilities in about 110 sites. And you can see the top states there. Georgia is not on that list. One may ask why. Well, the reason is as these facilities were developed, most of these prior to 1995, I would say, the, quote, avoided cost of power in the state of Georgia is very, very low. These other states, California, Maine, even Florida, and Michigan, the avoided cost of power, or what the utility calculated as their cost to generate power, is relatively high, which made it possible for you to compete from an independent standpoint. I'll push through this pretty quick here. You can see that the dominating, if you want to call it alternative energy sources, is hydro. And then wood and these others fall out below that. So why biomass-based energy? Well, here's about 4 points from our perspective as to why it's something that you should be taking a serious look at. It's an effective alternative to traditional energy sources. Remember me talking a minute ago about ill-conceived competing projects. It can contribute to energy independence and national security by displacing natural gas into the transportation sector. You remember I talked about none of these things exist independently. Fossil fuels do possess, regardless of your viewpoint on greenhouse gases and global warming and that kind of thing, from a financial perspective right now, fossil fuels possess an unquantifiable carbon mitigation risk. And primarily, it merges well with the electric system. When we flip these switches or we push this button here, we expect an immediate, instantaneous response. Not if the wind's blowing, not if the sun's shining, not if it's dark outside. Now, that's the way the electric market works. And you have to be able to deliver that. Investor-owned utilities are regulated to do that. Co-ops, any load-serving entity, they are judged on how well they do that. And so if you put in a facility that is not dispatchable, not controllable, not highly reliable, what do? You put more generation in to back it up. That's what you do, because you have to be able to deliver the capacity required by the system. Moving on. This is a study done by NREL back in, let's see, I think it says there 2004, and it compared the carbon footprint, if you will, of a variety of different energy sources, coal-fired with carbon sequestration, all the way over to biomass integrated gas combined cycle. Those two columns on the right, none of those exist today. The technology is expensive, and the financing of it is impossible because it's new technology right now. But what you see right there on the right center is that biomass, depending on how you do the math, direct fired biomass, which is what most biomass is today, is a very cost-effective method to impact a reduced carbon footprint. Now, we can't replace all coal with biomass. It's foolish to even try. But if you do the math, you'll see that there is a very real positive benefit from a carbon viewpoint for biomass. Moving on here. What are some of the other benefits? If properly sited, as I talked about earlier, an ill-conceived competing project. We have and I'll talk about this in a minute, we have a 50 megawatt project in eastern North Carolina. Been there since 1990. How many people are going to be foolish enough to move right next door and build another plant? Not very many. In fact, they will never get financed. So properly sited means not only the existing infrastructure that's out there, but the impacts that you're going to make, whether it's in I read the other day somebody's proposed a biomass plant inside the Beltway in Atlanta. I'm going, okay. The lawyers and the accountants are going to make a lot of money on that one. Firm electric capacity. It is a natural solar collector to kind of make a stab at that. We believe it's a precursor to the liquid fuel market, because the cornerstone of a liquid fuel market coming from biomass is steam and electricity. And they are substantial CO2 reductions. I'll zip through this. Quick question, Ben. It's 5 till 1?
Got it to about 1:15.
Okay. Economic impact, depending on who's doing the math, you can see the economic impact here. It is very, very positive when you're talking about a biomass to power facility. What is the environmental impact? Again, properly sited, appropriately conceived. It is minimal to be in a carbon sink if you want to talk about carbon. It is very minimal if you want to talk about what happens with regard to, quote, appropriately harvested biomass. A good friend Ann in here, we can talk about this all day long, and we have. And there is a reasonable discussion to be had about that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Here we go. Question is, how do you define biomass? There are some that would want to say it's only the sticks and twigs and leaves you pick up, by hand after a forest harvest operation. There are those that would say, no, we need to be able to clear cut everything. Well, that's two extremes that are just inappropriate. Brooks is not in here today, is he? I don't see him. Who's president of a forest consulting service, had this to say. It is, when Congress is making rules that is going to impact business, the legislative definition poses real risk. Amish talked about the cash grant. There were questions about whether or not the cash grant. It may be very true that there are facilities that are actually getting those cash grants. We're in the middle of financing a project right now, and a very real question, because of the deficit this country has right now, is how do you know Treasury's going to write you that grant 2 years from now? It's a real issue. Just a brief kind of look at the kind of biomass. I'm assuming you guys are going to have this available for later if somebody wants to take a look at it, but this stuff is available, most all of this stuff is available publicly. Hardwoods, softwoods, just some quick, is Jill Stuckey in here today? I don't see Jill. Back in January, AJC made this kind of comment about the National Biodiesel Board. Amish spoke to it. The elimination of the tax credits has real implication on business, just like the healthcare passing had a real implication on the tax liability that Caterpillar and AT&T, I'm sure you all read about that. Legislation has a real impact. The more proactive or the more active legislation is, the less certain business decisions become. What does that translate to? That translates to higher risk. What does higher risk translate to? Higher cost. Always does. Basic economics. So when we're talking about a energy source that already on a $ per million BTU basis is more expensive than the conventional oils or conventional fuels because it is far less energy dense, you create a higher and higher and higher bar to make something that actually works economically. I'll jump through this over here. We've seen all of these things. Why does it get costly? Some of the feedstocks. I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, we're going to grow switchgrass and we're going to grow this and that and the other and we're going to make, you know, lots of power and it's going to be cheaper than free. It doesn't work that way. As you move to the right over here on these things, the cost of those feedstocks get more expensive. And that is the largest single variable cost in biomass to power is the feedstock itself that you use to produce energy. So if you hear someone saying, well, we're going to grow a hybrid new kind of crop and we're going to make power and it's going to be less expensive than anything out there today, you can be assured they're smoking or breathing what's coming out of the stack. It's not happening. This is a slide. This is assumptions based on Decker Energy's work over the years that shows you some power generation costs, life cycle, bus bar type cost. And you can see that biomass is kind of right in the middle there. A conventionally conceived, well-sited, appropriately constructed biomass power plant. So what are the trends? I think biomass fuel, hopefully I've identified here, has moved from a primitive fuel to, when Decker first started, it was called a funny fuel, to perhaps a legitimate alternative local fuel source. Is that good or bad? Our view is that's good. The greater visibility, no thanks to the U.S. Congress, creates a greater scrutiny and oftentimes some more unqualified expertise. That's not good. The capital collapse in 2008 really drives development and ownership to have a much larger capital base, both from a equity and net perspective. That's not good. I think conversion of small coal plants are going to play a larger role due to the advanced environmental impact that biomass has. Co-firing by investor-owned utilities, despite the kind of fits and starts that we're seeing across the Southeast, it makes economic sense to do that, and eventually it will happen. I think that's actually good. But it's still the energy business. It's kind of like Rummy said about going to Iraq. You don't go to war with the army you want, you go to the war with the army you have. Well, we go to business not with the government we don't want, we go to the business with the government we do have, and we keep getting more of it. So I think you're going to see a lot more help from the government, and we can debate whether or not it's really helpful. So what does all this mean? A sustainable biomass conversion to electric requires a very thorough understanding and ability to execute in those underlying market fundamentals. Show you, I'm going to skip through some things here so I can get to a couple of case studies to kind of talk to you about. This is a project that Decker conceived in would have been the late 80s. Came online in 1992. It was a state-of-the-art facility at that point in time. Won a Power Plant of the Year award. It was constructed by Black & Veatch. It was constructed using industrial development bonds. So even back in the early 90s, as Amish I'm sure can testify to, tax advantage financing existed a long time ago. The recent machinations that we have, the stops and starts of PTCs and ITCs and picking winners and losers from a technology perspective, that's a fairly recent phenomenon. Craven County Wood Energy, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. This is one we have in eastern North Carolina, been operating since 1990. It is essentially a merchant power plant. We sell the power out of this plant into a wholesale market called PJM, and it's a very successful project for us. Glenn, this is near and dear to Glenn Loomer's heart. This is the project that we have down in Fitzgerald, Georgia. This is a conceptual arrangement of that. Glenn, you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you guys did a very thorough analysis and came to the conclusion that for the capacity you were looking for and the price you were looking for, biomass to energy actually filled the bill better than anything else. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, we didn't buy it specifically for renewable.
Yeah, and so this project was conceived outside the world of grants and outside the world of ITCs. There are PTCs involved in it, as PTCs were involved or potentially involved when we talked about this project. But this project competes on a head-to-head basis with Energy Today. It's located in a very good location. This is kind of an overview of the site. You'll see immediately to the south of that is a veneer mill. Immediately to the, I think, the west there is a sawmill. The picture's a little bit dated. Immediately to the north is another forest products industry. Half of the fuel supply will come over the property lines to the site. It's a very well-conceived facility. No need to step through all of that. Hereford Renewable Energy is another facility that we're developing up in the northeast corner of North Carolina. Again, we believe it's a very well-conceived and located facility. It's in the heart of the forest products industry in eastern North Carolina. We have done this for a long time. There are certain metrics that we look for to determine whether or not it's appropriately sited. One of them has to do with how much fuel is potential to be sourced there. In this particular location, there are 18 times the required supply based on our analysis using really publicly available data. Let's get through all this. Estimated project. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is one breakdown. This is about a $200 million project. So a 30% 30% investment tax credit, $60 million. Does that make the project fly? No, it doesn't. And that's because that same 30% investment tax credit is available to wind. And with wind, you don't have a fuel risk. With wind, you don't have a 2-year construction window. This has a 2-year construction window. Remember I talked a little bit about the breakdown in 08 of capital. We'll skip on past this. This is just more of that project. I'll come back to this in a second. Remember I talked about the breakdown of the capital markets in 2008. What happened in 2008 literally shrunk the bucket on the amount of capital that's out there. Not only the amount of capital, but the amount of capital that has a tax appetite. So the projects that go forward are not only the projects that are not extraordinarily capital intensive, because there's just not that much to go around, but those that have a much lower risk profile for the rate of return. A 20% return on a wind project today is pretty standard. You need to be approaching 35% on a biomass project for it to go, and it's because of the tax cash grant that's available. That has moved the market as far as the capital markets are concerned. Now, I'll do this in closing. As I said, I'm a Clemson graduate. Amish talked a little bit about liquid fuels. This is kind of what that looks like. And I know you folks here at Georgia Tech can really understand that. But for us Clemson graduates, this is what it looks like. So that's my presentation. I'll be glad to entertain any questions. Yes, sir.
That was a really good presentation. I want to say Amish's presentation was probably the most lucid I've ever seen on that subject. How do you manage the quantity risk? Because tree farmers, landowners are notoriously unwilling to give you a 10-year contract on their biomass.
Yeah, well, and let's ask why. Why do you think that is?
Because they can just leave the trees in the ground, wait for the market to pick up and sell them the next
They're perfectly willing to play the spot market. That's why. They have played the spot market for 100 years, and they're perfectly willing to do that. I was asked that very question some time ago, and they said, well, what if I sign a contract with you and the price of biomass goes up, and then I've left money on the table? And I said, have you ever heard of the parable of the vineyard owner? I mean, if we contract for a fair price, it's a fair price. It doesn't matter what's happening in the marketplace. My point being is, if you're working in good faith to generate a positive outcome for both parties, it's possible to do that. One of the things that we do to hedge risk is, and I talked about it there, is you make sure you're located where there is an overabundance of supply. And so the breakdown in the capital markets that I mentioned to actually works to our advantage where we have facilities that are in advanced stages of development, because an existing facility or an existing stake in the ground represents a much, much higher risk. You follow what I'm saying? For another facility. And so you're not going to have increasing levels of competition unless you have a step change function into something that generates a lot more value. If cellulosic ethanol from biomass becomes a real deal, that could create a step change function because there's a much higher value for a gallon of ethanol, potentially, than there is a kilowatt of power on a BTU basis. We also try to pass some of that risk through. In fact, we've signed contracts where some of that risk of the fuel passes through after a certain bandwidth, passes through to the ultimate buyer. Because today, the power industry works that way. The natural gas, the price of natural gas is typically passed through. Now, there are some fixed price contracts, but that's very typical.
So you're saying your sales contracts include a fuel adjustment clause?
A type of fuel adjustment clause. That is correct.
You don't need to lock down your quantity. How many acres, you talk about an overabundance, how many acres of forest land per megawatt do you need for a typical project?
Well, it depends on how you're using that biomass. If you're talking about taking every stick of biomass or every ounce of biomass off of that acre, you need each acre will grow about 10 tons per acre per year.
But you need a renewable.
That's right. And so you do the math there. What that says is a 50 megawatt biomass plant will need 50,000 acres of trees growing, and you can fuel it forever. That's what the math says. Other questions?
For the benefit of folks on the webcast, I've got a microphone we'll hand to you, and Marvin, you can have a seat and get comfortable.
Your North Carolina facility indicated that the supply was waste wood. What does that mean?
What does waste wood mean? Well, actually, the term waste wood it has both legislative meaning and practical meaning. Decker's view is that a biomass power plant is a bottom feeder for BTUs. So it's a biomass that has no higher and better use. We're not cutting down saw timber to make kilowatts out of it. We're taking the sawdust that comes from a sawmill and making kilowatts from that. So the sawdust would be a waste material. Slabs, tops, limbs from a harvest operation, bark from a pulp mill, those kind of things are really what we're talking about.
What is your assessment of where we are on the cellulosic ethanol?
We've been 5 years away for how many years? I mean, it's out there, but I'm not sure it's anywhere near commercial in this decade.
I have a question for Amish. On flips and sale-leaseback structures, where do the renewable energy credits end up? On which side of the table? Are the owners able to hold on to that, or do they have to give some of that up?
Well, in those structures, you were asking about the renewable energy credits. I mean that's a negotiation point. It's a commercial point as to, at the end of the day, when you have an investor coming into one of these deals, they're looking for their particular rate of return. And there's some avenues to give it to them. Obviously, number one, you give them the production tax credits or investment tax credits. There's cash flow available. There's depreciation deductions. And at the end of the day, the depreciation and the tax credits have to flow to the investor. If that gets them their rate of return, then the developer ought to be able to keep the RECs. If it doesn't, then you perhaps either give additional cash flow to the investors or you give them some portion of the RECs.
If I could add a little bit there, what we've experienced is RECs, or renewable energy value, or environmental attribute value, is a portion of return coming into the project. Tax credits are a return or a revenue kind of thing coming into the project. So at the end of the day, whether it's a REC or whether it's a kilowatt of power, it's revenue. And that all enters into the calculation of how that flip structure actually works.
I was wondering if both of you could talk about economies of scale. I've thought about biomass in terms of waste material, and I could be wrong about this, but I mean I've heard that your average farm puts off quite a bit of waste material, and I was just wondering if that's possible to have smaller scale production.
You want to take a shot at it first?
Well, I mean, most of the facilities we've seen have been about 10 megawatts to 30 or 40 megawatts in the biomass. So whether or not it's economic to do it any smaller than that, I'm not sure, but I can tell you that we found folks that have found it to be economic at the 10 megawatt level. Marvin may be more aware of whether smaller facilities may be viable.
Well, you have to define what you mean by economic. And what I can tell you from Decker's corporate perspective, unless the project is somewhere in the 30 to 60 megawatt range, we're probably not interested in it.
Close. Do you consider algae as part of biomass, and do you have any comments on the future of algae as an alternative fuel?
Well, I mean, to answer your second question first, do we see any future in that? I mean, we have talked to clients who are looking at doing that, and it's at more of a, I mean, it's in the early stages, and we've got to, again, I mean, it goes back to the question of does it become economic, and can we do this at the right scale? And I think we're probably a little bit early on to make that determination, but I do know, and I can tell you that there are a number of folks that are looking to do that on an economic basis going forward.
From Decker's perspective, Decker doesn't have a big interest in algae itself, but algae, the cellulose that's left over after oil extraction or something, or even dried algae, it is a biomass. It's a legitimate fuel source. I mean, it's BTUs that works. Are we currently buying algae? No, we're not. My guess is that algae is going to flow more into the liquid fuels arena than it will into the power industry. Yes.
That's right.
Yes, I was going to ask if you consider algae as a biomass. I think you answered it.
Yes.
It is a biomass.
Yes.
Just a minute. Here's a question from one of our listeners on the webcast. Just based on the discussion so far, it looks like let me try to paraphrase this. It looks like that the capital costs are significant, 100 million plus to get into energy production. From an entrepreneur's perspective, where pockets aren't quite as deep, what do you see as opportunities for entry by entrepreneurs?
Well, from Decker's perspective, I would say there are none. You don't need to be in the business. No, I'm kidding.
I will tell Mike you said that.
We're going to take care of all that's available. No, seriously though, the power business, my first comment, you remember my fundamental principle, this is the energy business. It is capital intensive. If you think you can get in the energy business and not be capital intensive, you're fooling yourself. It's not going to happen. So where is the opportunity at? It's going to be in the emerging technologies, if you will. Talk about algae. It's going to be as far as an entrepreneur is concerned, in that sense, where you're looking to develop a leapfrog technology. This is my personal opinion, if you will. In the biomass space, you can get involved in the collection, harvest, transport of biomass for a lot less than a gazillion dollars. But it's not cheap. It's still millions of dollars. So again, the fundamental point, it's the energy business. It's capital intensive. If you're going to be in it, be prepared for that.
I mean, the one thing I might add to that is we've been talking about biomass, obviously, with this being a biomass session. But investments in solar, we've seen at much smaller scales. Obviously, we've got clients who have a big warehouse with a lot of rooftop space, and they put solar equipment on there at a cost of $3, $4, $5 million. And so although biomass may be generally done on a larger scale, there are opportunities for renewable energy investments in the solar sector on much smaller scales.
See, Marvin, has Decker seen any applications of recapture of the carbon dioxide out of the ends of these biomass plants for sequestration and like hydroponic farms to increase atmospheric concentrations? And are you familiar if that even works?
I am familiar with it. I have talked to people that want to try that. They have not been able to deliver a system that makes sense.
And what do you mean by doesn't make sense in terms of?
That it doesn't affect a permit, for instance. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, well, we just need a slipstream off the exhaust stack. No, you change the temperature when you do that, which changes the air the distribution of emissions out of the stack, so it changes the permit. You can't just take a slipstream off the stack without considering the implications to the air permit. So does it a technology that potentially exists? Yes. Does it exist practically right now? No.
But the reason it's not practical, this particular point deals with permits and exhaust. Is that what I'm understanding?
In existing facilities, that is correct.
Okay.
Thank you. You mentioned among the benefits, accelerated depreciation, state tax benefits, mostly for construction of plants. Are there any incentives for in situ generation? I work in the College of Architecture, and we're thinking in designing communities that can generate power from algae biomass at the in situ scheme. In other words, we don't need the plant. We can generate energy in situ. Are there any incentives for those initiatives?
For generating electricity
on
or for
site,
biofuels?
yeah, on site.
I'm sorry.
Self-generation.
I don't think so.
No.
You got to have a third party in most cases, so.
Yeah, I'm not thinking. I don't believe that there are, but if you have a chance afterwards, we can talk a little bit more about maybe what you're thinking about, and we can think about whether there might be some opportunities.
When we talk about grants, wouldn't the grants be available if you were trying to produce your own electricity in a community where there's no third party? I heard in the grant side.
Well, go ahead.
I'm sorry. In the grant, you don't need to have a sale to the third party. You can use the electricity for your own use, if that's what you're asking about.
Well, but
I apologize for
don't you have to qualify? You have to otherwise qualify for PTC or ITC.
Well, you do, but you can qualify for the ITC even if you don't sell to an unrelated person.
That's right. I'm sorry.
So if I may have misunderstood the question, and I think that's a good follow-up point. That if your question is, can you produce electricity and not have to resell it to someone else and still qualify for the grant of the ITC, the answer is yes, you can.
Another question from the our webcast participants. A few months back, Georgia Power pulled its project, its biomass retrofit project, for what looked like emissions and certification issues. Was there more to it than that? The economics didn't bear out?
Well, you say you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics, but us Irish have difficulty steering clear of that advice. The fact of the matter is there are issues having to do with boiler MACT that are real and have to be considered. On the other hand, knowing what is publicly available knowledge about the Plant Mitchell conversion that you're speaking about, that was a very expensive endeavor to start with, and the way they were going to go about doing that. So it is not surprising that they've come to a conclusion that it's much more cost effective to put in combustion turbines, for instance, or to consider, in fact, co-firing at other coal plants. If they can find a way to do that, that's going to be much less expensive, probably, than a full-fledged conversion of Plant Mitchell. That's my guess. That may not be politically correct, but I think that's fairly accurate.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the relationship between tax incentives and renewable portfolio standards from the standpoint, do these tax incentives really provide any additionality beyond what the minimum state standards are currently requiring? And does something like the North Carolina modest requirement, does that change your business at all in North Carolina?
Well, we have a development project in North Carolina specifically because there is an RPS in the state of Georgia. As we talked, I'm sorry, in North Carolina. We competed on a straight-up basis in the state of Georgia for the project we have in Georgia, so it's a little bit different. Does the interplay, your question is, does the interplay of government incentives and RPS, does that kind of give you more than 1 + 1 = 2 kind of scenario? Is that kind of your question? This is a terrible answer, but I'm going to say it depends. It depends on the capital that's available. It depends on the market demand. It depends upon and by market demand I mean the utility or load serving entity that's going to be your counterparty in the PPA. It could have positive benefit. It could have no benefit. I think Ann wants to.
Just to follow up for a second, I mentioned last year Senate Finance had a hearing on technology neutrality for these types of fuels. And that was actually one of the questions that came up. They said, will there come a point in the future where that the RPS standard will obviate the need for incentives for these types of projects? And the answer is we're not there yet, but the sense was that, perhaps that could one day be the case.
I was just going to rephrase that question to follow up on it. How would a federal RES change your business?
Well, Ann, you know my particular view of the help that the feds give us. But I think overall, and in a very frank way, I think it is a positive because there's no way you know where to run at that point. The question becomes, is at what cost? Does an overall federal RES create a higher demand for renewable energy? The answer to that's yes. It clearly is yes.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I can speak up. I mean, have you had any experience or aware or any opinion on plasma gasification as being a viable alternative? It seems like biomass conversion is such a slam dunk in terms of what's around.
The answer is I'm aware of plasma gas. I don't have enough information to form a lucid opinion. I have an opinion, but it's not lucid.
Any other questions? Let's please thank our panelists for participating. Thank you very much for joining us today, and please go to the website secleanenergy.org for materials from today's presentation. Look forward to seeing you in April. Thank you.